Thank you everyone for joining us on this wonderful, wherever you are, Wednesday evening. It's my pleasure. I'm Gavin Clark. I'm with the National Museum of Computing. And it's my pleasure to be joined again by Dr. Kate Vigurs, author of Mission France, the true story of the women of SOE. And we'll get into what that is. We live in a world where technology increasingly is at the center of our lives. And TNMOC is obviously a technology museum. But it's important to remember that the people who are integral to the story of technology, people's work and whose lives are shaped by technology, or who in some cases depend on technology. During the Second World War, the Special Operations Executive was created with a very clear goal, which was to undermine the Nazi occupation of Europe. France was the largest concentration of SOE agents, more than 400 of them. And remarkably, 39 of those agents were women, and that's ordinary women plucked from everyday life who were reskilled and retrained to fight a clandestine war, serving as radio operators, intelligence agents, saboteurs, and fighting a secret war in the cause of freedom. Now, the story of signals intelligence tends to be focused on the communications and on the technology and the messages, but it's very easy to lose the sight of people in that story and the outcomes of that intelligence. Tonight, it's my pleasure to say Kate will attempt to rectify that by connecting us to the stories of these 39. I'm going to step aside, just a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, questions would be fantastic. If you could please just keep them until the end, so that'll be good. And if you aren't on mute already, if you could please place yourself on mute, so just to avoid any unneeded background noises, cats mewing, people, children playing, horses frolicking, all that kind of stuff. Just keep yourself on mute. And then at the end, I'll invite you to come back to obviously to post your questions. You can post questions throughout, of course, on the chat as well. That's all perfectly fine. Without any further ado, I'm going to step aside and hand it over to you, Kate. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you to everybody at the National Museum of Computing for inviting me back. A real privilege to be able to speak for you again, and this time to focus on the women agents of the Special Operations Executive F section. So I will speak briefly about how SOE was formed, but just so you know, there were lots of different sections working within France. I focused on F section because of these 39 women. I'm not going to manage to cover all of them tonight, but my idea is to whet your appetite really, in the hope that you'll want to learn more, and then maybe I could recommend a book. I don't know. Let's see how we get on. So hopefully you can see the screen. Hopefully you can hear what I'm saying. I'll just get that onto the proper screen share. There we go. During the Second World War, 39 women were specially selected to work in a secretive, clandestine, and, to be honest, a mainly male domain, the Special Operations Executive F section. These women ranged from housewives to mothers, shop assistants to countesses. They were put through a rigorous training program in which they learned things like silent killing, instinctive shooting, and sabotage, as well as survival tactics to prepare them for life as a secret agent. Some of them went by parachute, others by boat or aircraft to begin their dangerous work in enemy-occupied France, where most of them would work either as a wireless operator or as a courier. The latter often travelled hundreds of kilometres carrying vital yet incriminating information, whilst the former assisted in receiving arms and vital supplies, whilst undertaking huge risks to make contact with SOE headquarters over the radio waves. Behind enemy lines, they operated beyond the protection of the Geneva Convention, and at worst, they were given a life expectancy of just 6 weeks. Now, the need to use agents at all rose following the Nazi occupation of Europe and the desire of fallen nations to resist the new regime. And this was especially prevalent in France, the government of which, on the 22nd of June 1940, so just past the anniversary, had been forced to sign a humiliating armistice with Germany, in the same railway carriage, in fact, where the 1918 armistice was signed. In this document, they agreed, amongst other things, to split France into two zones: the occupied France, which was put under direct German control, and unoccupied France, also known as Vichy, which was due to the town where the governmental seat was. This was led by 84-year-old Marshal Pétain, who was a national hero of the Great War. I should point out, by the way, that my French is schoolgirl at best, so do forgive any mispronunciations. The fall of France came as a huge blow to the Allies, and it led to the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, writing a letter to the Secretary at War, Hugh Dalton, in which he said, "Now, set Europe ablaze." And this was to be achieved by the newly formed group, the SOE. Their objective was to coordinate and assist local clandestine activity against the Axis powers and their occupying forces in territories right across Europe and beyond. As such, SOE would liaise with, equip, train, and arm the local resistance. So when the time came, they could pave the way for the invading forces of D-Day and fight back against the occupiers. The SOE would assist with sabotage and subversion on every level, from smaller acts of sabotage, such as false intelligence and propaganda, to cutting power lines, derailing trains, and blowing up factories. And they would do all of this in spite of the Nazis' threat that any passive or active opposition to the German armed forces will incur the most severe of retaliatory measures. Now, employing women as secret agents for a formal organisation was a brand new concept. The idea had never even been mooted, let alone a reality before. And it all came about in April of 1942, when a groundbreaking decision was made whereby it was agreed that women would be recruited by SOE for work in the field, providing assistance to local resistance networks in occupied territory. Now, when I say it was a groundbreaking decision, this took me months when I was writing my book to find out exactly what had happened. And it actually turns out that the SOE recruiting officer, a guy called Selwyn Jepson, had discovered that women in the ATS pulled a lanyard which pulled a trigger on anti-aircraft guns. He then had a conversation with Churchill, who said, "I hear you're using women to do this." And Selwyn Jepson said yes, and Churchill said, "Good luck." That's the groundbreaking decision. But it was the green light to go ahead. And it was unprecedented, because up until this point, women's war work had involved contributing to the war effort in a very wide variety of ways, from munitions to driving, clerical work to nursing, most often on the home front, sometimes abroad, but never in the field of duty, and certainly none of them involving combative work or engagement with the enemy, albeit clandestine. Now, under normal circumstances, which is a strange word to use when you're talking about secret agents, but there it is. Under normal circumstances for the SOE, the women were likely to be given one of two roles, as I've already mentioned, the wireless operator or the courier. You may have heard of one lady by the name of Virginia Hall. Now, she was employed in the early days of SOE to set up safe houses and to work as an initial point of contact for other agents, but this was rare. The work of a wireless operator required someone with mental stability and the ability to work alone. They should be known by as few members of the network as possible and were to keep a very low profile. They would pick up messages from letterboxes, which was a pre-arranged place like a hole in a wall or a Bible in a church pew, or they'd have them delivered by courier. Now, this picture is of a real SOE agent. This is Jacqueline Nairn. It's a still from a film called Now It Can Be Told. People always use this when they're talking about wireless operators, but actually Jacqueline was a courier, but she played a wireless operator in the film, which was made in 1944. So we can forgive her. And it's a very good depiction of what a wireless operator would be doing in training. Now, the wireless operator would need to change location as much as possible to avoid detection by Nazi direction finders or DF mobile equipment. And so the maximum time for a live transmission at the height of the war was limited to 20 minutes. Now, that's sending and receiving with a decode in the middle using something known as the one-time pad. Any longer than this, and the wireless operator's location risked compromise, which would result in capture, or could result in capture. And of course, this was problematic as messages would become garbled or have a disrupted signal caused by jamming or a noisy frequency. Or messages were sent and received using unique codes that the wireless operator was required to memorize, or the one-time pad where there was a column which the wireless operator in the UK and the wireless operator in France would have. They would use it once and then destroy it. Even so, it's exceptionally complex work. And their work was fraught with danger. In fact, today marks the anniversary of the fall of one of the most important networks in France, based in Paris, called the Prosper Network. And if a wireless operator was caught, this could result in an entire network falling apart, as the agent was needed to ask for supplies, pass intelligence, or relay other important messages, such as arrest updates or requests for more agents. I would say the wireless operators had the most dangerous job of all, because they risked detection whilst transmitting or capture whilst moving about the countryside with their wireless sets. They knew details about other members of the network and its activities that other people did not. Training a wireless operator was also time consuming, and they were difficult to replace due to their specialized skills. At some stage during the core training, which consisted of a preliminary course, a paramilitary course, a parachuting course, and a finishing course, agents would be separated off if they were to become wireless operators and sent to the Midlands and Oxfordshire. For F section, it was here, Special Training School number 52, Tame Park, Oxfordshire. Most agents had to begin their wireless skills or their training from the very beginning, although some were brought in as wireless operators because their skill had been recognised in an auxiliary service, such as a Women's Auxiliary Air Force. They would start off by learning or perfecting their Morse code, and they would gradually have to work their speed up to in excess of 22 words per minute. Bearing in mind the General Post Office telegraphist was working at 12 words a minute, and that was in clear. That's a pretty remarkable speed. In training, agents were expected to practice until they were perfect and to be perfect every time. Recruits learnt to incorporate predetermined checks in their messages so that the listening posts in England could establish whether the messages were genuine, being sent under duress, or even being sent by the Nazis. Agents were made aware that once they were in the field, their messages would be sent to a particular receiving station in Britain, where hundreds of men and women, often members of the first aid nursing yeomanry, would constantly listen out to receive and reply to their wireless messages. If you heard my previous lecture on Georges Béguet a few weeks ago, I mentioned that Bletchley was remotely involved in the receipt of wireless traffic right at the beginning of the war, but eventually Grendon Underwood and Poundon Hall became the SOE listening stations when they finally managed to get their own traffic back off the SIS, which is a very complex and different story. Now, what about the wireless sets themselves? Well, to help avoid detection, they had to be portable and light enough to be carried by hand. That's not to say that they were light. The earliest wireless sets weighed about 32 pounds. They had to carry these around without attracting attention. Yeah, at that kind of weight, that's a difficult thing to do. The wireless sets were put into an ordinary looking continental suitcase, which were produced and aged by SOE's camouflage section. And the wireless sets were made at Station 9, which was Frith House in Hertfordshire, the SOE's research and development centre. By August of 1942, a suitable wireless set had been built that could operate from the mains and dry batteries with a range of some 400 miles. However, it was large and heavy, weighing 42 pounds, because it used obsolete bulky components. The wireless pictured on the left, the Tangmere one, is the Mark III SOE wireless suitcase that weighs only 9 pounds. And the one on the right is one I literally saw today in RAF Harrington Museum, which is a Type 2 wireless. But again, you can see the sheer weight of these objects, which would be carried around. The Mark III was considered by most SOE operatives to be the best version built in the war. It could be carried in a small suitcase with a range of up to 500 miles. So good enough to get back to England. It also had a feature where, with a throw of a single switch, the power could be changed from mains to battery. And this was ideal for thwarting Gestapo searchers as they switched off the power to buildings to listen for the transmissions they were monitoring to stop, thus narrowing the search for the area. So better to use battery than to use mains electricity. On their training, trainees were often sent on clandestine exercises with these wireless sets. They would have to go to a specific location, find an area from which to transmit, and send pre-arranged messages to a home station. Often they'd be sent to locations with trees or mountains or tall buildings. Remember the early days of mobile phones where you just couldn't get a signal if you were in the middle of a city. Exactly the same with the wireless operators. Now, occasionally SOE training officers would trail them and they would have to attempt to lose them. Sometimes the SOE would issue the local police with a description of recruits, and would be told that they ought to be brought in for questioning if they were seen. Now, the aim of all this was twofold: to make the training as difficult as possible, to test the recruits' resourcefulness and skill, but also to prepare them for life in the field as a wireless operator. The first female wireless operator to be sent into occupied France by SOE section was Noor Inayat Khan, codenamed Madeline. She was born in Moscow on New Year's Day 1914. Her father was a Sufi priest who had married an American woman, and their daughter's name meant light of womanhood. Noor and her family travelled widely, and were living in France by the outbreak of the war. Noor, amongst other things, was a writer of children's stories for the radio. The outbreak of war changed her life, and eventually she and her family escaped through Bordeaux into England. Her original intention had to become a nurse. However, in November of 1940, she enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or the WAF, doing so because her brother joined the RAF. Now, this seems like a jump in the narrative. Bear with me, I am coming back to it. In December of 1940, Noor completed WAF recruit training in Harrogate, North Yorkshire, my hometown, and moved to Edinburgh for a 6-month course at the GPO Moore School as a wireless operator. In due course, she was posted to RAF Abingdon, and it was here she learnt the somewhat derogatory nickname of Bangaway Lulu due to the noise she made when tapping Morse, which was allegedly due to chilblains on her fingers. In May 1942, she attended a course for advanced signals and wireless training, and following a promotion, Noor applied for a job in intelligence. Her wireless skills and bilingual abilities had already been noted, and in late 1942, she was called to Orchard Court, just off Baker Street in London, for an SOE interview. Now, ordinarily, a potential agent would attend 2 or 3 interviews before being informed about SOE and their potential role within it. But the recruiting officer, Selwyn Jepson, said that with Noor, he was able to come to the point more swiftly than usual and at this first interview. He said she had an intuitive sense of what might be in my mind for her to do. He hoped her security would be good and said she stood out as almost perfect for this type of work. She was obviously careful, tidy, and painstaking by nature. After discussing pay, the Gestapo, and the dangers of being employed as a wireless operator, Noor said she would accept the job. Jepson said that normally he would be uneasy and reluctant when anyone accepted the idea at once like that. It could and usually did mean it was being accepted without proper thought, or for some motive other than pure sense of patriotic duty, or call to a personal effort in the war, much beyond that generally experienced or undertaken. But with Noor, he was convinced she was the right person. Also, at this stage in the war, SOE were desperate for wireless operators, and it was probably that Jepson had to fulfill a quota and convinced himself that Noor fulfilled the criteria which would enable SOE to get a wireless operator in the field as quickly as possible. In her report, her initial report made on the 23rd of January 1943, it was clear her mission was already established, because it reads, if satisfactory after training, will be used in important operational role for which she has special linguistic and geographical qualifications. Another report by Lieutenant Colonel Gordon states if she's to be engaged as an agent after training, although the date was not yet arranged. Now, she began her SOE training in late 1942, having worked out her notice at RAF Abingdon. And she trained alongside 3 other female recruits, Yvonne Cormo, Yolanda Beekman, and Cicely LaFool. Her wireless skills were invaluable, and she often completed upwards of 40 hours a week at her wireless set. She also undertook a 96-hour scheme on the 19th to 23rd of May 1943, which determined her ability to conduct herself as a secret agent, albeit in the salubrious surroundings of Bristol. It would appear that Noor was required to stay in a safe house and make a number of rendezvous. So coming back to that training I was speaking about a moment ago, Noor was required to provide details of 6 suitable rendezvous for people of various social standing and 3 operational sites. She also had to partake in a police interrogation. The report states that, quote, she made several stupid mistakes during this interrogation, which could easily have been avoided by a little forethought. She always volunteers too much information when being questioned, such as when she was stopped by a policeman as she cycled to her safe house. He asked her what she was doing, to which she replied, I'm training to be a secret agent. Here's my radio. Want me to show it to you? The officer who conducted her interrogation said, "If this girl's an agent, then I'm Winston Churchill." The conclusion of the exercise was Noor must learn to be more discreet. But apart from this, the instructor considered it to be a good scheme. Now, Noor's final training reports were a great cause of concern. On the 24th of May 1943, this report was filed, which reads, "From reports on the girl, I suggest care be taken. She may not be given any task which might set up a mental conflict with her idealism. This might render her unsuitable from our point of view." Her idealism, by the way, came from her religion, which was Sufi, a beautiful religion where basically they're taught not to lie, which is very difficult if you're going to be a secret agent in enemy occupied territory. This report here says that Noor was not overburdened with brains, but has worked hard and shown keenness, apart from some dislike of the security side of the course. She has an unstable and temperamental personality, and it's very doubtful whether she's really suited to work in the field. You can see the pencil notes here in the bargains, which were written by the head of S section, Maurice Buckmaster. He put, "We don't want them overburdened with brains. Nonsense, and it makes me cross." But the man who wrote this report, Spooner, felt so strongly about this, he actually sent a copy of the report to SOE's most senior officer, Major General Gubbins. Buckmaster was furious that that damned busybody Spooner had gone above him and sent the report on to Baker Street. He said, "That bastard Spooner has taken against her." On Noor's report, he writes notes in the margins, as you've seen, and he also writes on other reports, if you'll excuse the language, absolute balls, and calls the instructors a mob of second-raters. Buckmaster had known from the moment he took Noor on that she had the wireless skills and knowledge of France he required. The rest of her recruitment, in my opinion, was merely a formality. It was an administrative requirement. He had no intention of turning Noor away. From his perspective, any wireless operator quite simply was better than no wireless operator. But it wasn't only the instructors who worried about Noor. There were two fellow agents who wrote to a lady called Vera Atkins, who was F Section's second in command, and they said they did not think she was the type to be sent. When the letter was brought to Noor's attention, she was apparently shocked and hurt and insisted she was the proper person for the job. Vera actually gave her the option to withdraw from the mission, saying, "For us, there is only one crime, and that is to go out there and then let your comrades down." She went, and this is her landing field here and her drop zone, or sorry, her landing zone out in the Loire Valley. She landed there on the 22nd of June, 1943. Her first wireless transmission on behalf of the Prosper network, where she was sent to work, was received on the 22nd of June. She went out a couple of days before. During her first few days, Noor met with Francis Satil, codename Prosper, and his contacts. She also met her organizer, Emile Gary, or Phono, but she did not move out to Le Mans as she'd been originally destined. Gary was carrying out much of his own work in Paris, where he was also spending time with his fiancée, so Noor stayed with him. But within a week, and as I said in the introduction, the anniversary of the fall of Prosper is in fact today, she watched the entire network fall apart around her. Miraculously, Noor managed to escape the wave of Prosper arrests. There is an entire chapter in the book about it if it interests you. But she believed it was more important than ever to maintain wireless contact with England. She was a lifeline, but she was also a live wire. Her lack of security was a major cause of concern, especially in these times of heightened risk and danger. Within the first few days of her mission beginning, Noor, now known as Jeanette Marie and codenamed Roland, as well as Madeleine, went to visit several members of the circuit, and she immediately made several mistakes. More than once, she left her code book lying around. A friend tried to shake her up a little by saying, "What reason do you have to suppose that I can be trusted, that I am not a double agent?" And her friend Vianot said he felt a little too familiar with her notebooks, and he requested that Noor burn them, and subsequently each message that she sent. But Noor refused. She said that SOE had told her to be extremely careful with the filing of her messages, and she would not part with her notebook. Now, what SOE meant by filing was burning them, destroy them, get rid of them because they are evidence. But Noor misunderstood it, and because of this, she kept every message not only in code, but also in clear. So they had the code. They could work out the code she was using to transmit. Since she was not allowed to leave her notebook lying around anymore, she carried it around with her in her handbag and in her wireless case. Now, Noor also developed a friendship, if not a romantic liaison, with this man, Frans Antelme. On his second mission to France, Antelme carried messages from Winston Churchill to the former French prime ministers, inviting them to come to England. But when Prosper collapsed, he went on the run. He and Noor were thrown together on more than one occasion, and they were in Gary's flat together. And when that was raided, they stayed at another flat. They travelled to Angers with Derek Hoare, who you may know is a suspected double agent of F Section, and they stayed with another agent known as Benoist. Both were romantically attached elsewhere, apparently, but it's not improbable that they had a love affair, although some would argue his interest in her was friendship or paternal. When he came back to England, he asked Noor to come with him, and this is critical because she declined, and she unwittingly became instrumental in his downfall when he returned to France some months later. At the end of June, Gary married his fiancée with Noor in attendance, but the blown circuit was incapable of engaging in any type of subversive activity. Noor and Gary laid low with a surviving circuit near Paris called Chestnut, but by the end of July, its agents were also arrested and Noor fled back to Paris. In August, SOE agent Nicholas Boddington found her and asked her to become his wireless operator. He told her that he would help her find a safe house before he returned to England. The shockwaves of the arrests of Prosper, the main network in Paris, had far-reaching effects, and anyone who knew or was involved with the man or with the circuit was now in danger. By now, Noor was transmitting from 3 different addresses, one of which was a flat in the 16th arrondissement. Baker Street was extremely concerned for her safety and sent her a message saying it was too dangerous to continue work and she must return to England. But she refused, saying she wanted to stay. She was the only link, she said, between Paris and London, and therefore she was crucial. Buckmaster knew that Noor's life was in danger, and it was only a matter of time before she was arrested. But Poste Madeleine, as it was known, was now the last link with Paris, and it had a crucial role. He accepted her sacrifice as a soldier and allowed her to remain. That's a direct quote from the man himself. She was advised to lie low, so she could receive but was not allowed to transmit, as the direction finders could find her, especially as she was now alone. She agreed, but she was back on air within 2 days. Here's the question, isn't it? Why did Buckmaster allow her to stay? He had told others to leave and they had gone. Despite her arguments to the contrary, allowing her to remain in Paris was quite simply a death sentence to Noor and a major security risk to others working there. But Noor refused to leave, saying she was the only means of contact with Paris and she could help rebuild Prosper, and as such, she was still very important. She knew the danger she was in and made the decision to face the inevitable, maintaining wireless contact for as long as possible. It would seem that she was determined to make a sacrifice for her country, and she did. Now, the Gestapo had been making inquiries about a British wireless operator, and although they did not know who she was, they were able to recognize her fist, the way she tapped out Morse code, and they knew she worked alone. She was put on a wanted list, and a price was put on her head, a very, very high price. When it came to it, she was betrayed for 100,000 francs, but the Gestapo were prepared to pay 10 times that much to get their hands on the sole wireless operator in Paris. In mid-October, Noor was walking towards her 16th arrondissement apartment when she saw 2 Gestapo men standing outside it, and before they saw her, she managed to disappear. But she knew she would have to go back eventually, because inside the flat was one of her wireless sets and her messages, all neatly recorded in that notebook. When she thought enough time had passed and it was safe, she went back, but the Gestapo men were there, and as she turned the key in the door, she was arrested. It's thought that the person who betrayed her was Gary's sister, called Renee, partly because Renee had a bit of a thing for Antelme, who's still on the screen here, and was a bit miffed when his attentions turned towards Noor. After the war, Renee was actually tried for this betrayal, but she escaped conviction by 1 vote and was then given compensation of 25,000 francs by the SOE for her services. Noor was taken to this place, the 84 Avenue Foch, and she already had escape in mind. And it was only through unusual, I think, treatment that she managed to attempt escape. She wanted to have a bath, and she tried to escape through the window, but she didn't make it, unfortunately, and she was brought back into the prison there. And again, she tried to escape in the early hours of the 25th of November with several other agents. But in the meantime, something critical had happened. Because she had been caught with her codes, the Gestapo wireless operators were able to use her wireless set to transmit back to England, and SOE believed it was her. They did not understand that she had been arrested, and they continued to send people out, including Antelme, as I've mentioned, and also another female agent, Madeleine Damamont, who was immediately arrested on landing. All of the agents who were sent in as a result of this England Spiel or Funkspiel radio play were sent and murdered in Nazi concentration camps. Now, Noor and two other prisoners, Starr, a fellow resistor, and Major Fay, also a resistor, decided to break out during an air raid. They managed to get onto the roof of the building, which you can clearly see in one of the images here, but they were caught and dragged back down. And they were asked to sign an affidavit saying that they would not try and escape again. Didn't work. Noor refused to sign the affidavit. And it was at this point that the head of the Gestapo, Hans Kiefer, flipped. He insisted that she be manacled and now treated as a dangerous prisoner, a Nacht und Nebel, a night in fog. She was sent to Pforzheim prison, and then eventually on the 12th of September 1944, that's an image of Pforzheim, she was taken from Pforzheim prison to Dachau, along with Jolanda Beekman, Eliane Plumen, and Madeleine Damamont. Now, the irony of that is inescapable in that she unwittingly was responsible for Damamont's arrest. They were put into individual cells, and the next morning they were taken out and kneeling 2 by 2, each pair holding hands. An SS man came up behind them and shot each of them neatly through the back of the neck. Noor's final words were "Liberté." Now, there were several other wireless operators, if you will indulge me in telling you a few more stories. And another one was captured. Now, this is Yvonne Baseden. She was born in Paris on the 20th of January, 1922, to a French mother and an English father. They'd met during the First World War. She was commissioned to join the WWII in December of 1940, aged 18. And in 1943, she was interviewed by Selwyn Jepson. She was very excited at the prospect of being able to use her language skills. But she said she found the wireless training difficult. She said they had to learn everything, every technicality of a wireless set, how to repair it if it went wrong. And part of being a wireless operator, we had to learn the coding and decoding. It was a bit of a nuisance, she said, especially the radio side of it, because you had to reach a certain speed and receive and send at that speed. She didn't enjoy parachute training either. This was the parachute course. She said it was unnatural and she just didn't like it. Her first attempt at infiltration into France was aborted as the reception committee lights and signals at the landing site were not correct, but she did make it in the second time, along with her circuit leader Hilaire, to set up the Scholar Network. She had 3 radios scattered around, one in the place where she was staying, and the other 2 were at different addresses. The yellow marker on that map is the Scholar Network there. She was constantly on the move. Transmission times were brief because of the possibility of interception. Now, one of the most amazing things that Yvonne Baseden did using her wireless set was to organize the largest daylight drop of the war at the time, which was just after D-Day. This was on the 25th of June, 1944. 440 parachutes of essential supplies, arms and equipment were dropped from 32 B-15 flying fortresses over the Jura region of France. Amongst those on the ground to receive Operation Cadillac, as it was known, was the wireless operator Yvonne Baseden. She said it was amazing, the middle of a Sunday morning, the first time these drops had been done by day. It was extraordinary, she said, a lovely sunny day, seeing all these parachutes dropping and knowing this was all equipment coming in successfully behind D-Day. And the thing she didn't say, she arranged it all on her wireless set. She requested these messages. She knew when the drop was going to happen, and she really was responsible for it. The goods were hidden away, distributed to various resistance and partisan groups across the region. But unfortunately, this drop also led to Yvonne's capture, because after the drop, they were due to go to a different location from their normal headquarters. But for whatever reason, they went back to their usual depot, a cheese factory. And somebody gave them away because he thought they weren't going to be there. And eventually, it's a complicated story, but they were all eventually arrested in the cheese depot and sent to local Gestapo HQ for interrogation. She always stuck to her cover story. She never told them once that she was a secret agent, and she was left without food and water for 3 days and was very badly treated. From Gestapo headquarters, she went to Dijon prison, and from there to Saarbrück, and from there to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was given the number 62,947. She had a dreadful time at Ravensbrück. She was put on various work details and contracted tuberculosis. But just towards the end of the war in April 1945, and this is a lecture in itself, something miraculous happened at Ravensbrück, and the Germans allowed the Swedish Red Cross into the camp, and they were able to take away people who were ill or who were frail. Now, it's not as good as it sounds, because they were held outside the camp compound for several days whilst a frenzied spate of executions took place. But regardless of this, a lady called Mary Lindell saw to it that Yvonne Baseden was on the Swedish Red Cross convoy, and that she managed to get back. They were known as the White Cross vans. She managed to get back. First of all, she went to Sweden, where she told me in an interview she woke up under the skeleton of a dinosaur in the Natural History Museum. And then she spent 9 months in King Edward VII Sanatorium in Midhurst recovering. Another phenomenal wireless operator with a desperately sad story is Lillian Rolfe. She was also at Ravensbrück. She'd lived in Buenos Aires and had come to England to undertake war work. After training, she landed by Lysander on the 6th of April 1944 near Orléans to act as a wireless operator to an organization based there. She was to secure radio links between them and SOE headquarters in London. She managed to send 67 messages back to the UK, and this enabled the Maquis à Lorette, as they were known, to receive substantial supplies of arms at a very difficult time by helping to coordinate parachute drops of arms, ammunition, money, and clothes for the resistance. This enabled the organisation to build up maximum strength and carry out important actions. A key to Lillian's success were her amazing wireless skills. Those in London who received Lillian's messages commented on her consistent accuracy despite the difficult conditions in which she was operating. These conditions were that the area was swarming with Gestapo by June of 1944, and Lillian had to keep moving constantly to avoid discovery. Her ability to keep working throughout these difficulties was recognised in her citation for the Croix de Guerre. The citation is from 1946. Although the region was fully controlled by the enemy, she succeeded, thanks to her good technical knowledge and presence of mind, in transmitting regular messages for 2 months, which led to the arming of the Maquis of the region by parachute drops. After the arrest of her superior officer, she courageously continued her work in the midst of increasing danger. Because of the danger, Lillian had to move constantly to keep her wireless set hidden, and she hid it in the homes of various resistance members. Her wireless set was also hidden in all kinds of different places: a wine barrel, under a baby's mattress, and in the roof of a dog's kennel. Through a very cruel twist of fate, Lillian was caught quite accidentally when the Germans raided the house she was staying in, looking for someone quite different. She was found asleep on her bed with her wireless transmitter next to her. She'd fallen asleep before managing to hide it, and the Gestapo had not expected to find a wireless operator there, although they were aware of her existence. Lillian was taken to Frayne prison in Paris and then transported with Denise Bloch and Violette Szabo to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where the three were executed in early 1945. Not all operators were successful in their training or in their work, and this lady is Odette Weiland. Her mission was cancelled before it even started. She basically came to SOE's attention because she had the right wireless skills. Her language skills weren't great, but oh, she just came at the time when they needed agents, and she wasn't ideal, but she was all right. The odds were pretty much stacked against her, actually, the minute that she landed. And she landed in the Auvergne in the southwest of France, where she met a lady called Pearl Witherington, with whom she'd done some of her training. And she immediately told Pearl that she had not learned her codes. Pearl was furious and told their circuit leader, Southgate, that you can't keep her, it's too dangerous. On Odette's first night, they put her to the test, and she proved to be useless as a wireless operator. Southgate sent a report to F section saying it was impossible to keep her in the circuit. Her inexperience and her lack of training, which had been cut short to be fair to her, meant she was unsuitable as a wireless operator, and they had neither the time nor the resources to invest in her. London decided she could be a courier to the Labour circuit south of Bourges. It's probable that this transfer was Odette's own suggestion, because she'd been in a relationship with Marcel Lecquier, who was Labour's circuit leader. They'd met at training school and reunited in France. They became engaged immediately upon their reunion. But several days later, Lecquier and his two comrades were betrayed by a Nazi sympathiser. Lecquier was tortured and was eventually murdered at Buchenwald concentration camp. His sister Mimi was able to prevent Odette from being arrested. She ran to her safe house and led her to safety just moments before the Gestapo arrived. There was no work for Odette to undertake, and so eventually she escaped across the Pyrenees under the guidance of a man called Santiago Strugo-Garay. And he rather liked her. She made quite an impression on him. And after the war, he came all the way to England, found her, and they married. As for her, once she got back to England, she was no longer needed by F section, and she was released for work with the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, where she ended the war working in Belgium. This is the last lady I want to talk about, and frankly, she's one of my heroes. Yvonne Cormo was arguably the most successful wireless operator in France in terms of messages sent. She was parachuted into the hamlet Saint-Antoine on the 22nd of August 1943 to work as a wireless operator for a man called Hilaire and the wheelwright circuit. She transmitted 400 wireless messages over the course of 12 months without a single miscode. With her help, the wheelwright circuit developed into one of the most active and important circuits in France, and for most of that time, she was the only wireless link with London. She also trained a locally recruited operator to help her, but in spite of this, she never had a day's leave or rest. She lived with the Maquis and helped her organizer in the reception and planning of operations. Her consistent efforts enabled the most spectacular development of a very fine and active organization. That's according to one of her citations. Due to her flawless wireless messages, the wheelwright network received 140 arms drops, and Yvonne was present at several of them. She also assisted in the cutting of power and telephone lines, resulting in the isolation of the Wehrmacht Group G garrison near Toulouse. She was very security conscious as well, in complete contrast to Noor. She really worked hard at fitting in and making sure that she did everything by the book. She said, you mustn't dye your hair too much, you mustn't have too much noticeable makeup, try and dress like the locals. Try and keep on the move, make sure that they can't find you. Now, one of the most amazing things is she was in a remote farmhouse for part of her work with no running water or electricity. The Gestapo knew they had a female wireless operator in the area, but they never checked that farmhouse because they believed that the British could not live without their running water and their amenities. But she did on one occasion come in with a very, very close encounter, and she was stopped at a German roadblock whilst traveling with Hilaire. They were questioned at gunpoint, and she was asked what was in the suitcase on the back seat of her car. She said, I opened it and knelt on the seat to show them. He asked me what it was, and I said radio, which in German means X-ray as well as radio set. In view of the fact I was meant to be a district nurse, he thought it was an X-ray set. He said, get out. The engine was still running, and we got out very fast. Cormo distinguished herself by repeatedly keeping to her scheduled times of transmission with the home station as battle raged around her, one so closely it actually tore a bullet tore through her skirt. And this is that very dress which is now on display at the Imperial War Museum North in Trafford Park. So these circuits, these agents all helped in preparation for D-Day. They helped to arm the resistance for D-Day. And I think we can see the importance of the wireless messages. Now, one of the things they also relied on was radio Londres and I think all the message personnel. So they would pre-arrange a message with London and it would come across the normal BBC wireless. One of the most important things the SOE did during the run up to D-Day and just after it was cutting the telephone lines. And as a result of that, the Germans were driven back to using the wireless and using the Enigma, completely unaware that Turing and his team had cracked the Enigma. And so we knew exactly what was going on. General Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, said in the wake of D-Day that SOE's role in Europe had played a very considerable part in our complete and final victory. He was so impressed with the work of the SOE in particular. So in total, there were 12 female wireless operators. You've met a few of them tonight. And they worked in F section in occupied France throughout the war. They were the only contact between SOE headquarters and the resistance. These women were the lifeline for SOE. Without them, SOE and the resistance could not have undertaken its vital role in the preparation for D-Day, in the deliverance of D-Day, and of course, in the liberation of France and Northwest Europe. If it wasn't for them, those supplies would never have arrived. And that pincer movement of the resistance coming from the interior of France and the Allies coming across the Channel would never have squeezed Germany the way it had. If it wasn't for these wireless operators, SOE would never have succeeded in their mission of setting Europe ablaze. And that's me. And there's the book. The rest of their stories, the other 27, are all told in the book Mission France, and a lot more about the agents I've just introduced you to and the fall of the Prosper Network, which I alluded to in the talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Just a couple of observations there I think would be incredible. I'm always constantly struck whenever you talk about this, about just the incredible size of these radio sets and just the remarkable escapes they have in, well, sometimes in them not being found by the Gestapo or by the Wehrmacht, in suitcases that are just improbable with false bottoms, and yet they seem to get away with it sometimes, apart from the case where was it Lillian, where they walk in and they find it on her radio decked out. Just so it's unfortunate sometimes when they find them, and other times they get these radios get away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yvonne Baseden told me a story of she was on a train and somebody wanted to a German asked her to take a seat in the railway carriage. She's like, oh my God. And he said, can I put your suitcase up? And he did. And she said, but it weighed a ton and the size of the suitcase wasn't relative to the weight of it. And she was convinced he was going to arrest her or think she was smuggling gold. But at the end of it, he just took it down and handed it back to her. She got away with it.
Were they just not aware, or was it they just not thinking? Do we think, or was it improbable that a woman?
Well,
could be
no, I hate to say it, but a pretty girl struggling with a suitcase. They bit of a patriarchal society here, and at the beginning they didn't really believe women would do this kind of work. They really didn't suspect women to start with. So yeah, not quite sure how she got away with it, but she did.
She did. Andy, I think you've got a question there. Do you want to jump in if that's okay?
Yeah, maybe others on the call have also had the opportunity to read your book. If they haven't, I commend it to you. It's a really good book. What I was fascinated by in reading it is how well you've laid out the story of all of these 39 women in SOE and F section. But I'm intrigued as to what it was that got you started on that journey, because you've clearly done an extraordinary amount of research. What was it that was the trigger? And were there any areas of unexpected, of things that you found that were unexpected in your research?
So it's a long story. Some of you may recall a TV program in the 1980s called Wish Me Luck. It was written by the same production team as Tenko, and I was just the target age range for that. Sunday afternoon, you know, even if we went for dinner at my parents' friends, I had to watch it. But I didn't know what it was. There was just something. And then my first degree is in drama, actually, and I worked as a performer in a museum, and I wanted a strong female character, and something clicked in the back of my mind with that Wish Me Luck. So I went to the Imperial War Museum. In fact, I lied because I was on a work trip, and I said I was going to research munitions workers in the First World War, and went to the SOE display and met their then SOE historian, and got hooked, absolutely hooked. So I wrote my script, I started an MA, which became a PhD. And then once I'd done that, I was like, no more. And then I was offered a book contract and thought, oh, go on then. Why not?
What about the surprises? Was there anything that surprised you in your research?
Me, yeah, there were some amazing little things that you think, how did that happen? One of the agents got pregnant to her circuit leader, and she gave birth in France. I just think that's utterly incredible. I know there were relationships and I understand why, but to have a child in occupied France while you're already undercover is bonkers. I also discovered something, it's a little more macabre, I'm afraid, but I didn't know that you could communicate from concentration camps out. And one of the agents, Cicely Lefort, wrote to her husband and said, I'm at a place called Ravensbrück, and he did some digging to find out what Ravensbrück was. I don't think he got the gist of it, because he then applied for a divorce while she was in the camp.
Wow.
Yeah, and the good girl, she rewrote her will. But yeah, there are incredible stories. There are surprises at every corner, really. And the, you know, Odette Weiland, bless her, she just wasn't right, was she? But she still went anyway. She still tried, which is a credit to her.
Thank you.
And I think Mick he raises the interesting, I don't know if you want to ask Mick or for me to paraphrase it, about Stefan Delmer.
Well, since he did so much broadcasting of that nature towards Germany, probably not in France, but I wondered if there might be an interesting connection with Stefan Delmer and some of the SOE operators.
I'm going to have to be honest, I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So it'd be something to look into, but I'm afraid I don't know the answer. How embarrassing.
No, that's okay. Very interesting stories. Thank you for this. I saw a play some years ago that someone wrote that. I don't guess that was you, as a girl about your age that talked. It was either Ravensbrück or somewhere, and Noor Inayat Khan and some of the girls. It was kind of naturally depressing play, but it's good to see some interesting factual details here, and these are good important stories.
I think that's one of the things that is missing actually from the study of SOE women is the factual detail, because the stories are so emotive. I think sometimes we get a little caught up in that and not actually look at the amazing things that they did and the training that they did. And you know, it's dreadful what happened to some of them, but it is good to focus on the success stories too, like Yvonne Cormo, for example. Such an amazing agent, and yet so few people have heard of her because she survived. She came home. So
I think it was interesting you picked up there, because there was some, I mean, we all think about the heroics and the infallibility, and I think it was Yvonne's story was incredible. Not very good at her job. And even Noor as well. I mean, there's something that there now, especially there's such a, I suppose, a mystique around this kind of story. The more you dig into it, the more it's interesting. I'm curious, do you think
it's quite a while.
The radio training, how complex was it? Because Yvonne obviously struggled with it, but then you had other people like, who was it, Yvonne Cormo. So that's Yvonne Baseden versus Yvonne Cormo. Pardon my French, I'm tramping it. Who was a master at this stuff. How difficult was the radio training for these people? And did many people burn out? Were they allowed to just drop out?
They did burn out, yes. And funnily enough, that's what I'm hoping to look into next, actually, is people who didn't make it through the training, because there was certainly more than the 39 who undertook it. And I think people did burn out. People just couldn't keep up with it, or, you know, just weren't able to get better. You know, there are times when you plateau, aren't there? And they just couldn't get to the right speed. I think the wireless training in particular was very, very difficult. It was very intense. they were learning not only how to, tap away their Morse code, they had to learn how to fix the wireless sets if they broke. They had to learn how to deal with oscillation and jamming and different frequencies. And, they just had so much to learn, and very, very technical. I mean, we look at those suitcases and think, flipping heck, they're a bit basic. Today we all carry one of these and it does everything a wireless set could do. That's got more technology than we sent into space. And yet the technology for these men and women learning these wireless signals and these wireless sets at the time was phenomenally complex. So yeah, it took a long time. I think Yvonne Cormo's was really short training, but because she'd already trained in the WWII, some of them already had the training through being in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Some of them were identified as being, they might be all right. And I'm sorry if this sounds sexist, but this is what they said in the 40s. Women were good at this because they're good at doing monotonous tasks like knitting or sewing. That's why they thought women made good wireless operators. And not to forget the girls here. We've got these 12 women in France. There are hundreds and hundreds of wireless operators here in the UK working at Grendon Underwood, at Poundon. In my former talk, the last talk I did, I talked all about the ones in the Bletchley area. There are girls sitting there doing exactly the same job. They're listening in for the people in France and Sweden and wherever to send their messages in. So they have to have the same training as well. They have to be as good. They're just not operating under duress in the same way. But the woman on the other end of Noor's messages coming in did actually say, this isn't her, doesn't sound right, it's not her.
That's interesting, because Caroline Barr, do you want to ask a question? Because I was going to raise this. Caroline, you raise this, don't you? Do you want to pop your question there?
Yes, thanks, Gavin. I was just curious to understand how the Nazis could hear the difference between Noor and other agents, but the operators here couldn't.
So they were taught to put in something called a true check and a false check. So they'd put in the true check when it was them. So there'd be a pre-arranged message or a nickname or something that would go into the message so they would know it was them. If they were then told to put the message in under duress, so if someone's got a gun to their head and they're told to send a message, they would miss out that check and they'd put in the false check. Now, it was different with Noor because they were using her wireless, using her codes, but of course they wouldn't have known the true and false check. Now, the girl on the receiving end, I don't know her name or who she was, but she said she's missed out her check. And the answer was, well, it's Noor. That's what Noor does. She misses things out. It's all right. And they actually started to ask her questions in the wireless messages to see if it was her. But they were able to, although she wouldn't tell the head of the Gestapo the answers to the questions, she did become friendly with an informer within the prison who would then feed the information back. The listening thing, being able to tell the difference in the wireless messages, it's known as your fist. It's the pressure with which you use the Morse key or the speed. I don't do Morse. I don't understand. Well, I do understand it, but I don't know how it differs. But my father is ex-Royal Signals and told me that you really can tell the difference. You can tell who you're listening to once you're trained to know what you're looking for. And these German agents were highly, highly trained as well. They were, they're not just some random bloke they've brought in off the street. They're very skilled wireless operators too. So I hope that's some sort of answer. Yeah,
absolutely. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So I was just going to follow up there. Do we know at what point SOE tweaked Noor had been compromised and these were fake messages? I mean, obviously they sent a bunch of agents over there who never came back because of this. Was there a point in which they tweaked?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember, but it was several months. And unfortunately, as I said, agents were dropped as a result of those messages. Not all of them were arrested immediately, but one of the other women in my book, Madeleine Damamont, literally landed into the hands of the Gestapo. She didn't even have time to prove herself. And yet they still interrogated her. They still tried to get answers out of her, and she hadn't done anything yet. But of course, she knew about the operations that were planned back at home, probably. So yeah, I would have to double check exactly how long Noor lasted, but I do think it was several months.
Cool. And I think that about covers it for this evening. What I will say is please join me in thanking Kate for the amazing presentation.
Thank you so much. And go to Mark's talk. I did a tour with him a few years ago and he's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Kate. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.